flea market in Willow Creek, Pennsylvania, was the kind of place where you could find anything if you didn't mind sifting through other people's junk. It was a crisp October morning, the kind where the air smelled like fallen leaves and wood smoke. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just killing time on a Saturday. That's when I saw it. An old photograph tucked between a stack of yellowed magazines and a chipped porcelain doll. The photo was sepia-toned, the edges frayed. It showed a family of 5, a stern-looking man in a suit, a woman in a high-collared dress, 2 young boys in knickerbockers, and a little girl in a frilly pinafore. But the photo was torn right down the middle, and the girl was missing from the waist up. Her legs were still there, standing between her brothers, but the rest of her was gone. "How much for this?" I asked the vendor, an elderly woman with a knitted shawl and a face like a dried apple. $5, she said, not even looking up. "Found it in an old house outside town. They were clearing it out after the last owner passed." I handed her the money and tucked the photo into my bag. It felt like a piece of history, something worth saving. I didn't think much of it until I got home. That night, as I was unpacking my finds, I noticed something strange. The torn edge of the photo looked different. It was hard to explain, but it seemed like a tiny sliver of the missing girl had reappeared. Just a sliver, mind you, a faint outline of her dress where there had been nothing before. I chalked it up to my imagination and went to bed. But the next morning I found something on my kitchen floor. It was a small scrap of paper, no bigger than a postage stamp, and on it was a fragment of the photo. The girl's hand clutching a doll. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't torn the photo. I hadn't even touched it since I'd put it on the shelf. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the photo had been damaged in my bag and the piece had fallen out. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. The scrap was too clean, too precise. It was as if someone had carefully cut it out and left it for me to find. That's when I heard it. A faint giggle, like a child's laughter coming from the hallway. I froze. My house was empty. I lived alone. The sound didn't come again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The next few days were unsettling. I kept finding more pieces of the photo around the house. A scrap with the girl's shoulder appeared on my nightstand. Another with her chin showed up in the bathroom sink. Each time, the pieces were perfectly cut, as if someone was meticulously reassembling the photo, one fragment at a time. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe I had a mouse that was dragging the pieces around. But the laughter kept coming, soft, distant, and always when I was alone. It was the kind of sound that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, the kind that made you check over your shoulder even when you knew no one was there. Then came the mirror. I was shaving one morning when I saw her. Just a flicker out of the corner of my eye. I turned and there she was. The girl from the photo. She was standing behind me, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She was wearing the same frilly pinafore, the same doll clutched in her hand. I spun around, but there was no one there. When I looked back at the mirror, she was gone. My hands were shaking so badly I nicked myself with the razor. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my sister. She lived in Ohio, but she'd always been the practical one, the one who could talk me down when I was spiraling. "You're freaking yourself out," she said after I told her about the photo and the laughter and the mirror. "It's just an old picture. Throw it away if it's bothering you." But I couldn't. Something about the photo felt important, like it was a puzzle I was meant to solve. So I started digging. I went to the local library, scoured old newspapers, and even talked to a few of the older folks in town. That's when I found out about the Holloway family. They'd lived in a farmhouse outside Willow Creek in the early 1900s. The parents, 2 boys, and a little girl named Eleanor. According to the records, Eleanor had disappeared one night in 1912. She was never found. The family moved away soon after, and the house fell into disrepair. As I was leaving the library, I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned around, and there she was, Eleanor. She was standing at the end of the aisle, her doll dangling from one hand. She smiled at me, and then she was gone. The sight of Eleanor in the library shook me to my core. I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it. She wasn't just a figment of my imagination anymore. She was real, or at least real enough to make me question my sanity. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. When I got back, the house felt different, colder, heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. I walked inside and immediately noticed something on the dining table. Another piece of the photo. This one showed Eleanor's face, her wide, empty eyes staring straight at me. Her lips were curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't comforting. It was predatory. I picked up the scrap, my fingers trembling. How was this happening? Who or what was leaving these pieces for me to find? I decided to take my sister's advice and get rid of the photo. I grabbed it from the shelf and shoved it into a trash bag, along with all the scraps I'd found. I tied the bag tightly and carried it out to the dumpster behind my house. As I dropped the bag in, I heard it again. That giggle. It was louder this time, closer. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty alley and the fading light of dusk. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside made my heart race. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the mirror above my dresser. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I sat up and turned toward the mirror. At first, I saw only my own reflection, pale and wide-eyed. But then, slowly, Eleanor appeared behind me. She was closer this time, her face just over my shoulder. Her hand was pressed against the glass, tapping lightly, as if she were trying to get my attention. I screamed and scrambled out of bed, backing away until I hit the wall. When I looked again, she was gone. But the mirror was false, and written in the condensation were two words: find me. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't focus, couldn't think about anything but Eleanor. I needed answers. I drove out to the old Holloway farmhouse, which was about 20 minutes outside of town. The house was a crumbling ruin, its windows boarded up and its roof sagging. The property was overgrown with weeds, and a rusted iron gate hung crookedly on its hinges. I pushed the gate open and walked up the overgrown path to the front door. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The door was locked, but one of the boards covering a window was loose. I pried it off and climbed inside. The interior was a time capsule. Dust-covered furniture, faded wallpaper, and a staircase that creaked with every step. I found myself drawn to the upstairs hallway, where a series of family portraits hung on the walls. One of them caught my eye. It was the same photo I'd bought at the flea market, but intact. Eleanor was there, her face whole and smiling. As I stared at the photo, I heard a noise behind me, a soft shuffling sound. I turned around, but the hallway was empty. Then I felt it, a cold hand gripping my wrist. I yanked my arm free and bolted down the stairs, out of the house and back to my car. When I got home, I found another piece of the photo waiting for me on the kitchen counter. It was Eleanor's eyes, staring up at me from the scrap of paper. And this time, there was a message written on the back in faint, spidery handwriting. "You're running out of time." The message on the back of the photo fragment sent a chill through me. You're running out of time. What did that mean? Running out of time for what? I couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor was trying to tell me something, or worse, that she was leading me into a trap. I decided to go back to the Holloway farmhouse. I didn't know what else to do. Maybe there was something there, some clue that could explain what was happening. This time I brought a flashlight and a pocket knife, though I wasn't sure either would help if Eleanor decided to show herself again. The house was even creepier in the daylight. The sun filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. I went straight to the upstairs hallway where I'd seen the intact family photo. It was still there, but something about it had changed. Eleanor's face was no longer smiling. Her expression was blank, almost sad. And her eyes, they seemed to follow me as I moved. I reached out to touch the photo, and as soon as my fingers brushed the glass, I heard it. A faint, whispering voice. "Help me." It was so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. "Help me." The voice was coming from the end of the hallway. I followed it, my heart pounding in my chest. The door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, and a cold draft seeped through the crack. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small, with peeling wallpaper and a broken rocking chair in the corner. But what caught my attention was the dollhouse on the floor. It was an exact replica of the Holloway farmhouse, down to the smallest detail. And inside the dollhouse, sitting in the tiny rocking chair, was a miniature version of Eleanor. I knelt down to get a closer look, and that's when I saw it. A small, folded piece of paper tucked inside the dollhouse. I pulled it out and unfolded it. It was a letter written in the same spidery handwriting as the message on the photo fragment. "They buried me in the garden. Please find me." My stomach churned. Was this real? Had Eleanor been murdered and buried on the property? I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was right in front of me. I grabbed the dollhouse and carried it downstairs, determined to search the garden. The backyard was overgrown with weeds and thorny bushes, but I could see a patch of disturbed earth near the back fence. I started digging, my hands sinking into the cold, damp soil. It didn't take long before I hit something solid. It was a small wooden box, about the size of a shoebox. I pried it open, and inside was a collection of old toys, a porcelain doll, a tin soldier, and a locket with a faded photograph of Eleanor. But that wasn't all. At the bottom of the box was a bundle of cloth, wrapped tightly and tied with a ribbon. I unwrapped it, and my heart stopped. It was a child's bones. And I dropped the bundle and stumbled backward, my mind racing. This was real. Eleanor had been murdered, and her remains had been hidden here for over a century. But why was she reaching out to me? Why now? As I stood there trying to process what I'd found, I heard the giggle again. It was coming from the house. I turned around and saw her, Eleanor, standing in the doorway. She was no longer a flicker in the mirror or a shadow in the corner of my eye. She was solid, real, and her eyes were filled with a mixture of sadness and rage. "Thank you," she whispered. And then she was gone. I didn't know what to do with the bones. I couldn't just leave them there, but I also couldn't bring myself to touch them again. My mind raced with questions. Who had killed Eleanor? Why had her family buried her in the garden instead of giving her a proper burial? And why, after all these years, had she chosen me to find her? I called the police. It felt like the only logical thing to do, even though I knew how it would sound. "Hi, I found the remains of a child buried in the garden of an abandoned farmhouse. Oh, and by the way, a ghost led me to them." Yeah, that would go over well. When the officers arrived, I left out the part about Eleanor appearing in my house and the mirror. I told them I'd been exploring the property and stumbled across the disturbed earth. They seemed skeptical, but took the bones and the box of toys as evidence. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a tired face, asked me why I'd been poking around the farmhouse in the first place. "I found an old photo at a flea market," I said. "It was of the Holloway family. I got curious and started looking into their history." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. The next few days were a blur. The story made the local news, and suddenly everyone in Willow Creek was talking about the Holloway family and the mysterious remains found on their property. The police launched an investigation, but they didn't find much. The house had been abandoned for decades, and there were no living relatives to question. As for me, I thought it was over. I thought finding Eleanor's remains would bring her peace. She'd stop haunting me. But I was wrong. The pieces of the photo kept appearing. Every morning I'd find a new scrap somewhere in the house, on the kitchen counter, on my pillow, even in my coat pocket. And the laughter didn't stop. If anything, it got louder, more insistent. One night I woke up to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. I sat up, my heart pounding, and saw her standing outside. Eleanor. Her face was pressed against the glass, her eyes wide and pleading. She raised a hand and pointed toward the woods behind my house. I didn't want to follow her. I wanted to close the curtains, bury myself under the blankets, and pretend none of this was happening. But I couldn't. Something inside me, curiosity, fear, maybe even guilt, compelled me to get up and go outside. The woods were dark and silent, the only sound the crunch of leaves under my feet. Eleanor was ahead of me, just visible in the moonlight, her pinafore glowing faintly. She led me deeper into the trees, to a small clearing I'd never noticed before. In the center of the clearing was a tree, its trunk twisted and gnarled, and hanging from one of the branches was a noose. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Eleanor stood beneath the tree, her back to me. She turned slowly, her face pale and expressionless. "They didn't bury me in the garden," she whispered. "They hung me here." And then she was gone. I don't know what to believe anymore. The police found Eleanor's remains in the garden, but she told me she was hanged in the woods. Was she lying? Or was there more to her story than I could understand? The pieces of the photo keep appearing, and the laughter hasn't stopped. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see her standing behind me, her hand reaching out as if she wants to pull me into her world. I don't know how to help her. I don't know if I even can. But one thing's for sure, Eleanor isn't done with me yet. If you've ever heard of a ghost story like this, tell me in the comments. And if you made it to the end of this chilling tale, type, "I'm still here," to prove you survived. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life horror stories that will keep you up at night.